And this event is officially sponsored by the Environmental Justice Committee of the Thomas Merton Center. Wanda and I are on the board of the Thomas Merton Center together. It is also sponsored by Pittsburgh 350, which you've heard of here, the Pennsylvania Interfaith Power and Light, and also want to thank Gail and First United Methodist Church for hosting us so generously here tonight. It's the perfect venue. All the gear, all the technical stuff just worked. Thank you. Hallelujah. I was reflecting as I was preparing for this. In fact, it was hard. I was trying to not actually do a lot of writing or thinking for a couple weeks right after COP to just let it filter, let it simmer in. And there literally are a million different ways that you can interpret the COP21 process, event. I wrote down a few reflections of all the different ways you can look at it, and they're sort of like polar opposites. The COP21 agreement is a new flag on the mast of civilization pointing towards the Earth. It's a white flag on a planet devastated by economic activity. It's a signal flare on a sinking ship. It's a cigarette during the afterglow. It's a wake-up call. It's a hollow promise. It's a call to arms. It's a robocall. It's a touchdown. It's a Hail Mary. It's a beautiful dance among nations. It's a raping and pillaging just like it has always been. It is cause for hope. It is cause for despair. It is as horrible as we are willing to tolerate, and as visionary as we are willing to dream. I can't just come out with an opinion. I did quote myself once in the slides, you'll see that. But I'd like now to send a pointer back to my pre-COP presentation. This was the goal that I rolled out. COP is to achieve a legally binding and universal agreement on climate with the aim of keeping global warming below 2°C. Did we do it? Well, it's all those things. I also want to remind ourselves of this frame. These are sort of the big things that I wanted you to remember before we went to COP. It happened in Paris, December 2015. They're going to be talking about all kinds of degrees. There are going to be legally binding components and some non-binding components. How fair will the CO2 allocation be among nations? Finance mechanisms, what will they be? Will they make sense? Are they anything close to what's necessary? And the technological savior. You may know it happened in Paris in December. It happened. And they signed they adopted the agreement. And the agreement will go into effect in 2020. They will probably have a signing ceremony on Earth Day this year. They talked about not a lot about 1C. They did talk a lot about 1.5C, which is a wonderful surprise. They also talked some about 2C, but frankly, more of the conversation at COP, I felt, was around 1.5. And I'll talk more about that. And then 2.7 plus. The United Nations claimed that all the national commitments that came in prior to COP put us on a trajectory towards 2.7C above pre-industrial levels. But I talked to some folks at Climate Interactive, actually before and during COP, interviewed them at some length, and learned that their modeling shows it's actually 3.5C above pre-industrial levels. And I asked them, well, what's the difference between the UN version and your version? And they said, well, the UN version assumes that India is going to continue to cut their emissions beyond what their commitment technically says after it's over. So the technical reading of it is 3.5, but the kind of the politically viable version, the likely maybe scenario, although it's hard to say how likely it is, was sort of, they felt it was close enough to 2.7 that they just rolled with that. So now you know the difference, technical, non-technical. The whole couple weeks was just filled with that kind of stuff. But that was a biggie. I have a few quotes that I want to share with you that just give you the breadth of some major figures talking about this. We've got John Kerry. This is a tremendous victory for all our citizens. It is a victory for all of the planet and for future generations. Contrast it with what James Hansen had to say. And as we learned in my previous COP presentations, James Hansen was the one who's saying we got to shoot for 1C, no higher than 1C above pre-industrial levels. Here's his quote about it all. I had to put asterisks in it. It's a fraud, really, a fake, he said. It's just bull for them to say, we'll have a 2C warming target and then try to do a little better every 5 years. It's just worthless words. There's no action, just promises. As long as fossil fuels appear to be the cheapest fuels out there, they will be continued to be burned. So two really important people, two very opposite things to say. And I quote myself. So if you want to know what I really think about this whole thing and just leave now, this is in a nutshell. Better than expected, far from sufficient, and relies on unprecedented technological and cultural transformation to avoid catastrophe. Techno-wizardry. I think their language for that, I'm guessing, is market forces. That market forces will create magic technologically. And they talked a lot about market forces. In fact, you could say that they felt the entire purpose of COP was to send a strong signal to the markets. There was also a story for me that happened here. And I stumbled across this site. This was one of the terrorist sites in Paris where they had that horrible mass shooting just a few days before COP officially started. And in many ways, this set the tone. It set the conversation. This is what occupied the hearts and minds of Parisians, much more than this massive COP thing that was happening there. At least that was the story that the person I was staying with had to share. I asked her, is everybody talking about COP? Because there's so many ads up on every subway that's just COP, 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 everywhere. You could just see it. She said, no, we're talking about the terrorism. And the terrorism ultimately put a huge, and I think painfully powerful damper on the public voice. This, I felt, going in was a dance. It was going to be a dance between public outcry for more and political talking points of how much they are able to do given the circumstances. And then there was going to be this feedback cycle, I thought. The feedback cycle basically was eliminated. So considering there was no major feedback cycle, at least in Paris, I heard there were over 600,000 protesters globally, but there was a protest scheduled, I think, for over 200,000 in Paris. And I maybe, at any one occasion, maybe saw as many as 10 to 20,000 ever, which is a whole different ballgame than 200,000. Especially 200,000 people hell-bent on civil disobedience, which was the case for the weekend after COP was supposed to end. There was going to be mass civil disobedience, and that did not happen, as far as I'm aware. Certainly not the mass headline-grabbing kind. And I stumbled across this as I was escaping the police. This is the first weekend. Right as I got in there, I got off the plane and went to the place where they had all the shoes out from protesters. They had the shoe protest, and I saw them cleaning up the shoes. I didn't quite get there in time, cleaning up the shoes. The Pope's shoes were there, and other people's famous shoes were there. Instead of protesters, they had shoes on the ground. But people came and gathered anyway. And there were police there, and I was pretty nervous because I didn't want to get arrested right at the beginning of COP. I had to come back and give a presentation at the end, so I thought, oh. But I could see there was sort of protest dynamic brewing in the air, and you could see hundreds of cops starting to creep in at the edges of the square, hundreds, and all these police vans started to creep in. And at the beginning, I was like, wow, there's no cops at all. And they're like, oh, there's some over there, and there's some over there. Then I just went back and interviewed a couple people, and just took a few photos, and then people started to gather. There was a little bit more angry chanting. Some of the anarchy folks were there, sort of anti-capitalism, combined with some or some sort of environmental, not anti, but environmental folks. There was sort of a unholy alliance there, or I don't know if alliance is the right word, but they were all hanging out in the same square. And I thought for sure, if protests are banned, then as it was indicated by the government, then there's going to be some crazy massive kettling like arrests. They just cordon off the whole square and say, okay, everybody's arrested. So I was kind of extra jittery about that, trying to look for, okay, are they putting around kettle lines? They didn't put around kettle lines. And in fact, they didn't arrest anybody. They didn't even move on the crowd until the protesters started to dance in the street to block it. And I thought that was very interesting. I thought, wow, that is something. And you'll see I have a little snippet of video of right at that moment where they just started dancing. I caught it on video. And then the police started to move in. And then the police checked with me. They're like, so you're here or you're there? And I was like, I'm there. And he said, well, if you're there, you have to be far. And I was like, no, can I just hold my camera up over the side? And he's like, no, go. So I had to go. But if you want to see what happened after that, you can watch Amy Goodman's Democracy Now! They were in there. And some people got tear gassed, and there were over 200 arrests that day. I believe that was the anti-capitalist folks there, but I don't know exactly who was arrested. It was a mess, but Amy Goodman covered it really, really well, and I was not there. I escaped, and I started running far away from the tear gas and stumbled into this. I didn't even plan it. I just ran into it. And I was struck. It's hard to see in here, but there's bullet holes, big, fat bullet holes right there, there. And there was another one just catty corner to it, all covered in flowers, just covered in flowers and really cool art. And it was just hard, it was hard to see. So were the protests banned? Questionable. These are some of the posters that I saw around, just setting the tone, setting the stage for you guys. There were lots of posters, and I have a lot more on my Flickr account, all over town. And I thought this was a very interesting sign. Anti-cops. So the cops were there. They banned protests. They were actually pre-arresting climate activists making use of the terrorist state of emergency to preemptively arrest climate activists there in their homes before they did anything, in theory. And so there was a lot of frustration with the cops. And yet they didn't kettle and they didn't move on people until they blocked the streets. So, again, it was all these things. All the different ways you want to look at it, you can find an argument, and you can find 50 arguments to back your story. And then there'll be 50 arguments in the exact opposite direction. And so now I have a little video to help set the stage. Yeah, I'm flying in. I didn't put any music or anything, I can just talk about it. So you get there, and then this is in the middle, right in the Champs-Élysées. It's just right there. Then you take the bus, get to COP. This is the entryway. All the flags of all the nations involved. I believe over 195 nations were sort of part of this negotiation. Not all attended, but it was huge. Very well organized, too. I rarely had to stand in line. This is inside the COP. They had this cool art here and there. It was sort of industrial chic. France booth. All the nations had their own booth. But some were very large. That's where all the media was over there. But there was another huge media section with thousands of media. This is the Indian booth. And they had this amazing waterfall. I just couldn't help but share it with you. It talks to you. Check it out. So it says words about, it's like touting India's amazing climate. India at COP21 Paris 2015, it says. India at COP21 Paris 2015. And advertising, 5th largest wind energy project in the world. Way to go, India. This is a mini Eiffel Tower at the COP site. Really cute. Then there it is in the distance, and then I pan around, and this is the sort of the main walkway, or that art. These are quotes from people encouraging strong action on climate. Polar bear was there. This was a cool exhibit. They had 4 projectors that made a a full globe, and they would show all sorts of interesting demonstrations on this, talking about climate change and other things, weather.
Census was
this was one of the press conference rooms. I spent a lot of time in these, just listening to people. Then this is more of that animal art. Then it was filled during one occasion with a protest action. Just about all the protest actions, as far as I know, that were in COP were sanctioned. So you had to get special permission and obey special rules and only do a certain thing. And this is now outside the blue zone. All that was in the blue zone, the very secure area that got in with my press pass. This is the Climate Generations area open to the public. This guy came from Bahrain, just showed up and had a whole bunch of songs to sing about the pollution that they're suffering in Bahrain. So he just decided to sing because he didn't know what else to do to get attention.
And the car has the license plate C5085MG.
This is a 360 view in the generation space. Notice that's a line for food. The food lines were less than a quarter of that length in the blue zone. Like barely any lines in the blue zone, tons of lines in the public zone.
The lines in the back. You can see the farmland.
This is Randy Sargent from Pittsburgh demonstrating his project on a big screen in the Climate Generations area.
If we pan to the
This is a time lapse over a number of years.
To Fort Worth.
And that's fracking. All those fracking
dots that
wells.
appear. White dots everywhere.
Fracking in Dallas. And he can do this anywhere in the world over like a span of 15, 20 years.
Fracking for methane.
It was amazing to watch. And one of my favorite little clips. This was leaving COP. They had this little art wind turbine project. It's just beautiful. And then this is the Christmas village in Paris. That was the Eiffel Tower all lit up for COP. With words and different imagery just shining on it. So that brings you to the place. So you now are with me a little bit better. You know the landscape, the terrain, the energy, the colors. I wish I could share with you some of the smells and the flavors. It was amazing. They had like incredible restaurants all throughout the COP conference area, the Blue Zone. They had much, much less interesting food in the public zone, climate generation space. The other side of this story is the technical side. So much technical stuff. People would spend time counting the brackets in each revision of the COP agreement as it emerged over the 2-week span. And I was like, what are all these counted brackets? Basically, all the things that they haven't decided yet show up in brackets, like multiple choice adventures. Bracket 1, bracket 2, bracket 3. And so you can see how well they're going along the pathway to how harmonious things are by how many brackets there are and how many they're able to get down each iteration of the agreement. Many would call this not so much a legally binding agreement. There are legally binding elements, but the word that I've heard that seemed to make the most sense to me in really describing what this is it's basically a political agreement. It's like people putting their political selves on the line because it's not legally binding. But there is a lot of strength in the political strong-arming that happened. And Todd Stern, I think, used the word goading. So I looked up what goad means, and it's any number of things, but it's like a pointed stick used to get cows to go where you want them to go. But I thought of the United States with their pointy stick, pointing it at all the smaller nations, goading them. We're going to see this slide a lot. this is kind of how I made sense of basically how I chose to describe how COP went according to Mark. So if you see the red there, this circle here, the red is it met expectations. A sense of whether it met expectations. So red, a lot of red here means they didn't meet expectations in a certain area. The gray indicates what I think was necessary. And this is not, I'm not doing this with a spreadsheet really, it's just like my instinct. And then this way out here, this edge, this is like visionary what's needed, or this is going beyond what's needed to be really visionary, leading the way. So you can see all of COP to me was insufficient. Sometimes it met with expectations, sometimes it exceeded expectations, and sometimes it came in under expectations. And so we'll be referring back to this over and over again, but I'm going to start with the primary goal. And I think Christiana Figueres, who is the one kind of leading the United Nations group on COP, she tried to characterize this main point of COP. I wrote it down so that I could share it with you. She said, we need to document where we are, we need to document where we need to go, and then chart the path between them. And I thought, oh, that's an interesting way to think of it. I thought they just wanted to send a market signal and wait for technology to save us. But I think it's worth noting what these leaders say and then considering in your own mind and holding them accountable to their own words even. Because in some ways, that's all we've got. And also, they put enough words down that we can actually hold them to something pretty significant if we choose to. All right, primary goal. The text says we're shooting for well below 2 degrees C and pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 C. It's much more than that, but that's the nugget. That was significant. And there was a group of vulnerable nations that got together, led in part by the Philippines. And this was a very well-attended session, kind of trying to get people to think harder about 1.5 C. This was very early on in the COP. And there was also a little tiny protest shooting for 1.5 C. Look at this little tiny protest. It's a little close up. But this was one of my most redistributed photos because 1.5 C became so iconic for the COP. Just so you have a sense of the scale, I walked away to take a picture of what it looked like. That's the protest and all the cameras around it. So in the early days, I was like, oh boy, 1.5 is not looking good. There's a little protest and some weak nations gathered together, and otherwise everybody was off doing other things. There was also a little bit of other protest, like citizen groups did little protests here and there, and you saw little signs floating around. This was, you can see the red. Anytime you see the red behind it, that's on that little mini Eiffel Tower at COP. A bunch of protesters just stuck all their signs on that, just left them there. So it got kind of papered over by the end. But then I sat in on a session, a press conference. Anyone know who this is? Todd Stern. This is like the main guy for the US below John Kerry and Obama, but he's like our primary climate negotiator. At least that's my understanding. He was the main guy, the only guy sitting in this press conference telling about what the United States is going to do. And he was asked specifically about 1.5 C. And in that press conference, he said, I don't know the exact quote, but it basically said we are open to having a mention of 1.5 C in the final text. Boom. Everybody was like, what? Are you kidding me? That was amazing. And that started a snowballing effect. Canada stepped up and said they support 1.5 C also. With brand new Trudeau jumped in and said, yeah, 1.5 C, we got it. And I don't know if he actually said it. I think one of his ministers said it. But that was huge. Canada jumped on board. And then all of a sudden, there became this kind of high ambition coalition emerged. Sort of was in secret for a while, and then it just emerged, and the US was a part of it, and all these vulnerable nations were a part of it, and other nations were joining right, left, and center. It was like the big, powerful nations decided to get a heart, get a spine, and join up with all these vulnerable nations and include a mention of 1.5 C in the text. Now, I also heard rumors that there was some dealing with the devil in that exchange where they said, well, we'll be on board with a mention of 1.5 if X, Y, and Z. And I don't know what that deal was. but I do know that there was also a clause in the COP agreement that said that the COP agreement won't be used as like a justification for litigation or suing for damages. It didn't say you can't sue for damages, I think. Just said the COP agreement is not the mechanism by which you could theoretically sue for damages. But it was very explicit about that. And so it seems that their nations may be going on considering other international routes, but it was really a big issue, this suing for damages. If that is excluded from possibility in the future, then who do we blame for this? If not the United States, if not China, if not the EU, and then how do poor nations recoup their losses? Very serious material losses of life and property for nothing that they did. It's a very serious question, a social justice question here. So I'm sort of alluding to a deal with the devil, but I don't know if there was one. It just seems like there was probably some dealings beyond just, hey, we love you guys, let's all do 1.5. That was my sense. As soon as 1.5C got traction on the last Friday of the COP, basically the official last day, the nations, it became clear in the text that, wow, 1.5C is actually really going to be in here. And so all of a sudden, the press corps, which previously basically ignored all these 1.5C things, turned on their heels and jammed every conference room with any scientist who was talking about the viability of 1.5C. Suddenly, the entire COP21 press corps, as far as I could see, filled the hall to capacity. The police had to block it for safety. So I scooched over to the other door and got a better view. And I grabbed a little earpiece thing and plugged in my recorder to it and started to listen. And they were going on about how 1.5C is really challenging, all this stuff. Then they mobbed all the scientists afterwards to ask them questions about 1.5C. So what I think happened is that this strange wording of well below 2C and pursuing efforts to limit temperature increase to 1.5C, that became enough to send a significant pulse of attention to the international press, which in itself, I think, will send a pulse of academic interest and research academically and at the United Nations to explore and study how to get to 1.5C and what does it mean to us. So when, I would have said, well, heck, before the COP, I would have said, oh, 1.5C, but there's nothing binding, and pursuing efforts, what does that mean? That means that you can just sit around and think about it. But to see the press turn on its heels and go from that tiny press conference, that tiny little protest to this massive thing really sunk in at like, okay, so this is how a political deal works. There's politics, there's this give and take, there's this wishy-washy, but there is force. And the press is leveraged as an arm of that force, I think. So that was one of the big points that I wanted to share with you. Now we're going to get to the long-term goal. The text says, reach global peaking of greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible, seeking greenhouse gas neutrality in the second half of this century. Pretty vague. You can see I said it did not meet my expectations, did not meet expectations, far from sufficient. But I thought the primary goal, that 1.5C, that was a better result than I expected. This long-term goal, worse than I expected. It was my understanding, and I was hearing that wording under consideration had been tighter. And also, there's a big disconnect between 1.5C and even shooting for 1.5C and sometime in the century to get carbon emissions to neutral. To neutral. So basically, you're not putting in any more than you're taking out. But there was some confusion about what the text actually meant also. So that's my interpretation. People were saying, it's carbon neutral. It means, yeah, we're not putting any more carbon in the atmosphere. But it may be making use of carbon sinks and other things. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're not emitting anything, just that you're taking out as much as you might be emitting, in theory. It gives some outs. All the language is filled with these little outs. It doesn't mean that they're all going to be taken, and it doesn't mean that they're going to be financially or viable for the citizens, that their governments are going to do these outs. But the outs are in there. Nations really wanted them in there, one nation or another. And then Kevin Anderson mentioned to me, and then I'll show his little quote, I believe. Yep, oh, so I have a couple little photos. What is the long-term goal the activists want? Just leave it in the ground. And then there was this protest that we saw in the earlier shot. They were encouraging a stronger long-term goal text. A lot of the protesting was around the long-term goal. That was what a lot of the young people wanted.
There's an action happening here in the COP21 Center.
We are still demanding for a transition to an end to fossil fuels by 2050. As the world is moving toward 100% renewable energy, we recognize that the transition is already happening. Now we've seen some of the challenges toward achieving the long-term goal that we need. But we did not come to Paris thinking that this would be the full solution. We are the solutions, and we're going to keep pushing for the 0 by 2050 future that we want.
We are unstoppable. Another world is possible. 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 We are unstoppable. Another world is possible.
So you can get a sense now of how these protests kind of work. It's like protests for the press in this little cordoned off area to almost nobody. So that's the long-term goal. It was a big issue for activists, and we came in underwhelmingly. I think that they were also hoping, they were putting a lot of, the United Nations and the whole group was putting a lot of stake into the ratchet. That's what we're going to talk about next, the ratchet mechanism. They also talked about this as like a stock take. And they said, the text says, each party shall communicate a nationally determined contribution every 5 years. Turns out that India was pushing for 10 years, I heard in a rumor. That was disappointing. Saudi Arabia was also very frequently mentioned as like not helping. But India's in a unique spot where they're just on the cusp of huge amount of development, and their current population is using a tiny fraction of the fossil fuels that the developed world is. They're like, come on, it's just we're next, come on. But we put in a 5-year measure for that. Also, and part of the reason why I've got it here as a little better than expected is, well, 5 years, it could have been worse than 5 years, but also there's some early review that starts in 2018. So it's like they're not going to implement these until 2020, but they're going to like have a preliminary stock take in 2018. So in many ways, it's just barely early enough to kind of maybe bend the arc of our carbon trajectories enough to maybe stay within a 2-degree trajectory, because we're far from it right now. And if we keep burning it for another 5 to 10 years, we're not even going to be able to get close to 2. And that's what I think Kevin Anderson here talks about in just a moment.
If we are serious about 1.5, this is the point that Johan Rockström was making. We need to review and revisit these and make much more robust commitments in the next 2 years.
2 years?
Yeah, well, because for 1.5 degrees centigrade, the budget is so small. If we wait till 2020, there will be no budget at all. Even now, there's very little budget for an outside chance of 1.5. So by 2020, we will have used all that budget. So we have to, if you are serious about 1.5, we have to significantly dramatically revise our INDCs almost immediately, or believe that negative emission technologies in the future will save the day. Well, even if at 2 degrees C, I think we need to be reviewing the text, as Johan was saying, every 2 years. I do not think the 5-year cycles are sufficient. We need to be becoming much tighter than that. The INDCs are far removed from what is necessary even for 2 degrees centigrade. And if we are serious about 2 degrees C, and remember, my judgment is that we are on the outside chance of 2 degrees C now. We do not have a good chance of 2 degrees C anymore. We'll have to revisit those INDCs as a matter of some urgency. So whether it's 1.5 or 2 degrees C, we need to revisit the INDCs. I have no problems with people thinking about negative emission technologies, but I think only 1 in 10 scenarios should assume that they work. At the moment, somewhere between 9 and 10 scenarios out of 10 assume that they work. So they are ubiquitous in the discussions here. If you look at the IPCC scenarios, of the 400 that have a 50% chance or better of 2 degrees centigrade, 86% of them include negative emissions. The other 14% assume that global emissions peak before today.
Let's talk about negative emissions and just some of the daunting statistics around the assumptions of negative emissions. He was pretty bearish on negative emissions. I'm reading a book right now by Tim Flannery called Atmosphere of Hope that has extensive discussion about carbon emissions removal from the atmosphere. He talks about seaweed and other things, but Kevin felt very strongly that this is not something that we want to like bank on. So I'm trying to do some more research about that as well so I can kind of speak to it. There's so many different people exploring all different ways to pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, because if there's one takeaway that we've got from this COP agreement, it's like, oh yeah, this is serious and we need to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Oh, and by the way, the UN has actually been assuming that in spades for years already. Just we're sort of catching up to what that means technically, and it's daunting. And I would say that I feel that the politicians want to not be let off the hook. It has to be politically safe for them to make these strong moves. So they're basically screaming at the top of their lungs, "We're going over here! Now catch me as I fall!" You know, and so we've got to make sure they feel like they're going to be caught as they lean over into this. Otherwise, they're going to look and not lean. I think that's the intersection of where the citizenry and the politicians meet. Okay, INDCs, intended nationally determined contributions. Unfortunately, these turned out exactly as expected. Nobody changed a single INDC during the whole COP. There were people ready to do instant calculations of, have we gotten below 2.7 or below 3.5? And I kept asking them, have the INDCs changed? Has anybody put in a better INDC? Have they gotten more ambitious? Nope. Nope. Not a single one. There were some little surprise moves, like the United States said we're gonna increase a certain type of aid from 400 million to 800 million. There also were, I think, there was more participation from nations around the world than was expected. So I was disappointed that it wasn't ratcheted up a little bit, but I counted 160 as of January 18th, at least listed on the United Nations website where they track it. There may be more than that. I kind of have a suspicion that there are, but they got a lot of participation, and most of it came in before COP21, which was the goal, and they did it, and that was extraordinary, and that meant that never before in human history have so many nations assessed their own carbon emissions, because that's part of the INDC process. You have to assess your emissions and then see where you're headed, where you can go, and how you can bend that curve, and that assessment was made over 100, with over 160 nations, and that just in itself sent another one of these pulses. And I remember on the yurt trip, that Your Environmental Road trip, we were always faced with these little weird challenges all the time, and because we're trying to keep our garbage to a minimum, not make any garbage for a whole year, and so that makes you think a little bit. We found, though, that very often to meet these challenges, it would only take us like 5 minutes of thought, and then it would work for the whole year. And so just a little tiny nudge of, hey, would you think about this INDC a little bit? The ripple effect that can have across a nation when the leader says, hey, we're going to think about INDCs here, we have to, just that thought process can really start some transformation. I'm not saying it will, but much more than I would have said before yurt, where it only took a couple minutes and then we think there's awesome solutions up that are just really easy and cheap and quick, but it took that thought. So here these nations are thinking, and I think that's really, really important. All right, the mechanics. Mechanics are weak. They're like some of the weakest. Only public voice I give a lower grade than mechanics. What do I mean by mechanics? What are the mechanisms by which we're going to accomplish these goals? Or does the machinery inside of this thing make sense? Do the gears mesh? The mechanics. As I mentioned earlier, France was commended on a masterful delegation or organization of these events. Very few lines anywhere. The security was friendly, and everything ran very smoothly. There weren't any weird surprises. At Copenhagen, there were some weird, crazy surprises, and everybody was upset, and it was a mess. But this one went very smoothly. In a way, it's kind of funny because I feel like a lot of our imperial past, the empires of Europe and America even, they have led us to this point of problematic climate emissions and centralization of power that's leading to this sort of unbalanced global presence. And in sort of an interesting turnaround, France used its sort of imperial legacy And because of that, it's diplomatic global reach to really draw people into this conversation and strong-arm them and pull them in a meaningful way that they probably couldn't have had they not previously been an empire. This is technically going to be, the mechanics, again, technically going to be a treaty under international law, but the goals are not legally binding, only basically the mechanism. And I feel that it was largely influenced by Republicans in Congress who would not ratify any climate anything that came anywhere close to them. In fact, they rattled their sabers and said, we're gonna undo whatever you guys do over there at COP. And that's a huge disappointment. That's so out of touch with the entire global consensus. I mean, it was on display at COP. I mean, and I'll go into some of those details of how momentous this sort of pulse of communication was globally, but it just etched into the history books even deeper than it already was, this sort of unfortunate out-of-stepness that the Republican Party in the United States has with the entire global community, political community, business community, civil society, you name it, they're out of step with them, and it had a material degrading influence on this agreement. As I mentioned, the mechanics, it's largely political with this goading. I just want to insert that into the mechanism is a pointed stick of political goading, as Todd Stern used goad. Now it's my word. I also believe once you realize that this is a political agreement, then you can start to see the actions of the other nations, their negotiations and their fronting and their forward and their back and their attempts at this and that. In India, going for 10 years, and Saudi Arabia maybe trying to keep out wording of 1.5C. I feel like it puts that action into context that they're not trying to hold off the inevitable. I think they're trying to hold off or tone down or reduce the anticipated goading that they are susceptible to in the future. So if the agreement is formed in a certain way, like if India doesn't have to come back for another 10 years, they can get a whole lot of industrialization done before the next round of big goading takes place. They're not going to balk at the agreement. They went along with it. They didn't say, oh, it's 10 years or bust. Nobody also wanted to have their hands on a failed agreement. That was very clear all the way through. No nation was like, yeah, we hate it. We're done with this. No. That was not an option. And that was happening much more in other COPs. But I think that it's an interesting lens to consider, since there's 50,000 lenses to consider, might as well have another one, where, nations are trying to think about how do we avoid or get the least amount of pressure on us in future iterations of this thing. I was disappointed also that there was no built-in finance mechanism. There was not a 1% tax on all fossil fuels or all Wall Street or whatever you name it. There was also not a big cap and trade or a big fee and dividend or international scheme for adjusting money based on who's using the most carbon. No, they used some kind of funny language because there are some nations that don't like to talk about cap and trade. I think they don't like to talk about the commodification of nature, which I think is that is good. And one of my big disappointments in the COP is that it still leans on commodification of nature. They use this word internationally transferred mitigation outcomes to get around it. So that you can sort of have, maybe that can include a cap and trade system, and maybe it can include a fee and dividend system, all these different little systems. And the text says, parties shall, where engaging on a voluntary basis in cooperative approaches that involve the use of internationally transferred mitigation outcomes towards nationally determined contributions, promote sustainable development and ensure environmental integrity and transparency. That's the mechanism for swapping credits that they have in there. My mouth is full of wool. Internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. I was like, wow, that is a diplomatic word crafting. As I said in my previous presentations, verbal gymnastics. Wow. But hey, if it works, then it works. The thing is, a lot of the conversation that I was hearing was about how this thing, if it emerges at all, is going to come up in sort of regionally and nationally first, or nationally and maybe binationally or locally first, and then maybe it'll creep up to be something international in the future. That was a surprise to me. I thought, wouldn't it be simpler if we'd all just kind of agree? And they're like, no, it's much more complicated. We have to do it this bottom-up way. And they haven't quite figured out all the nuance around that. They barely even started. But as the Pittsburgh Citizens Climate Lobby knows, that there are options, and we are pursuing in many ways lobbying for a fee and dividend in the United States, and there are Republicans who are in the, I don't know, crosshairs is a bad word, but like, are in the purview of some very sophisticated, thoughtful, caring, and loving lobbyists who want to help them pave the way, to pave the way for them to see the light of day on climate. And they're making very material progress, and I think that we could see a fee and dividend or some other mechanism in the United States in a couple years, I think. We just have to have a little bit of a shift of the demographics. And a few Republicans need to come out, and the weather needs to just continue to sort of do its part. Kevin Anderson, I think he mentions that he felt that this was possibly weaker than COP15 technically. Again, disappointment. There were some stronger references to important things like science and other things, I think. I'm not quoting him, but that was the essence of what I got. And then their wording around compliance was very weak. So how do you enforce the mechanics? Well, get a load of this. Shall be expert-based and facilitative in nature and function in a manner that is transparent, non-adversarial, and non-punitive. Put on the kid gloves and try to help nudge everybody over to the line. So I thought that was a fun language to share with you. Some of the other language that the mechanics is trying to do is bend the curve of emissions or chart a path of continual reductions until we're on the right path of 1.5C to 2C. But as the previous little video highlights, there's not a lot of time we can wait to bend that path. So sure, bend the path. That's great. We need to do it, but we need to do it really fast. Really fast. I've just talked right through a lot of my photos, but the good French logistics, good French food, so much good French food. In fact, this is the French playing their part. They made pastries with edible COP ink on the top of the pastry that I ate. And then, of course, little recycling bins and other things. Part of the mechanics, I think, of the whole event was, well, I was going to use this as a pinpoint to talk about the Republican Party. So Obama's trying to do the best he can without going for ratification of anything. And one of the things that he did that I thought was a real clear signal, to me at least, as an activist, was that all the national leaders had about 2 to 3 minutes at the beginning of COP. They all gathered in. Biggest gathering, potentially, quite likely, biggest gathering of world leaders in world history. And it happened to be about climate change. And everybody had 2 to 3 minutes to say their piece. All these world leaders gathered. And Obama spoke through, I can't even count the number of timer bells to give a 13-minute speech. He blew the doors off of that. And he didn't pay any attention to those timers. And nobody yanked him off the stage. But he used some very powerful language and took way past his due time to have a word with the world about climate change. And I thought that was, on the first day of the event, thought, ooh, this is a good sign. And then a couple days later, they come out and say, yeah, we want to put 1.5 in the text. The US definitely had a different stake in the game this time than in previous COPs. It's really good. So the French was really good at handling the mechanics of the treaty, but they sort of bailed on handling the mechanics of the public voice. So this is when the citizens started to block that street, the police were ready to go. They did an okay job, but they created a state of emergency and banned protests. I'll mention it again. And so I feel like, sure, handling logistics and diplomacy is great, but the people's voice was a vital part of that diplomacy, and to excise it the way that they did preemptively, I think is inexcusable. another element of the mechanics. So where are the shalls? So there's this big hullabaloo at the end of COP, the shalls and the shoulds. Did anybody hear about that? That the ending was delayed. We were all gathered around. I'll get to this in a little bit. But ending was delayed because some sleepy admin had like administrative person or somebody had swapped out, put in the place of it. It had been should for multiple versions, and then it just flipped to shall somehow, and they just had to flip it back to should. And then it was safe for the United States to not need to pass it as a treaty, ratify it with the Republican Congress. But here are where the shalls show up. You can see in mitigation and transparency, a lot of bindingness in the transparency. It's easy to bind people to a process. It's hard to bind them to an outcome. And that's kind of what they have, because the implementation, tiny amount of shalls. But this, I think, is another interesting technical assessment, how to look at this text. All right, moving right along to funding. Funding, I have it sort of falling right and sort of expected. Everybody was gathered around $100 billion. The text says, shall set a new collective quantified goal from a floor of US dollars, 100 billion per year. So basically 100 billion from 2020 to 2025, and probably more after that. I did a quick Googling, though, and found that we currently subsidize fossil fuels as of 2013 to the tune of $1.9 trillion a year globally. And that's about $480 billion a year in direct money paid. That's globally. And I got that from a Grist article. Thanks, Grist. But they mentioned that it's mostly in developing nations to support the poor. So that's, again, it's 50 different ways to look at this. You want to help the poor, and you want them to have energy, but do you subsidize fossil fuels? It's bad. But it's good to help the poor. So it's tender. It's always delicacy in these negotiations. Also, 100 billion is pocket change compared to the some $89 trillion of infrastructure required to make this renewable transition. But it doesn't mean that the 100 billion is like that's all that will be spent. In many occasions, you spend a little piece of that 100 billion to tip the scale to make it cheaper to do the renewable version, and then maybe that they're already going to spend $1 trillion over here, but with an extra couple billion, maybe it tips the scale, and then that trillion is all of a sudden going towards green instead of going towards coal or natural gas. So 100 billion is a leverageable amount. It's going to be really important how we leverage it. And boy, by golly, it would be great if there was a lot more to leverage. And it pales in comparison to how we're helping out our fossil fuel industries currently. Also, COP was sponsored by a lot of corporate sponsors. You see IKEA, but I got to give IKEA a thumbs up. But there's energy. There was a Pinocchio event, the Pinocchio Awards, that was giving awards to corporations that sort of were the biggest liars around climate. This is how some of the protesters felt about the finance at COP. This was leading right up to all those police that were about to arrest those people. They were marching with these signs. They also had some people in press conferences. They handed out all these scarves. Stop funding fossils. So those are my reflections about funding. And then social justice was a biggie. I felt like there was a lot of securing your advantage in this conference. That these nations were about securing the advantage of their nation, not necessarily securing the advantage of their people or their indigenous people or their most vulnerable. That was a disappointment. But there's lots of balancing elements. The Climate Vulnerable Forum was a group of 40 countries, started in 2009 with the Manila Paris Declaration, and they produced a unified statement from the most climate vulnerable nations at COP. And they've been advocating for years to get this loss and damage provision in the COP agreement. And it turns out, for whatever reason, it's really good when you get a whole section for yourself. And it turned out there is a whole section just on loss and damage. In many ways, they're trying to articulate the things that cannot even be reimbursed or compensated for, like loss of heritage, loss of, in Brazil they had this mine tailings flooding this whole section of river. That is like people who live along that or animals that live along that, how do you even quantify the loss and damage from that thing? And so this loss and damage was a major social justice and initiative endeavor to get recognized in COP. It doesn't mean that we're going to fix it, but it at least gives a platform for holding ourselves to a higher moral standard. I wrote here, it propagates the COP19 Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage associated with climate change impacts. So there was a lot of work done at COP19 around loss and damage, and they basically just yanked that out and said, yes, refer to that. But people seem to be pretty pleased with that. And inside the text it says it promotes the implementation of approaches to address loss and damage associated with the adverse effects of climate change in a comprehensive, integrated, and coherent manner. And as I mentioned earlier, it acknowledges that loss and damage in some cases involves more than that which can be reduced by adaptation. A little bit about Warsaw Mechanism I won't go into. These most vulnerable nations also lobbied for the 1.5C in the text, which got in. And that gives a little bit extra, a few extra points to the social justice meeting or not meeting expectations. Felt that 1.5C is a major coup for the vulnerable nations. I talked already about this sort of blame is off the table in the agreement. And the specific text says, the agreement does not involve or provide a basis for any liability or compensation. That's technically what it says. So it doesn't provide the basis for it. And I don't know the legalese, I'm not a lawyer or an international law expert to know, but my English reading of that says, it doesn't provide a basis for it, but does that mean that you can't sue someone ever by another basis? And I suspect, I don't know, but my English version of myself says, I think there may be other ways, but who knows if those are viable. This was the climate generation space outside of the blue zone. Quite pretty. Vegans were en masse seeking social justice. There was lots of vegan activity. The vegans were very vociferous. Here's a very beautifully painted vegan. And the COP21 was also referred to by some, I think even President Hollande of France, I think, as the COP21 as like in many ways a peace treaty. And I thought that was a very interesting consideration, especially after the terrorism that occurred, which you could draw a line, direct or indirect, to Syria, to ISIS, to Syria and the droughts that they've been suffering and the unrest that's happening there, connecting to the terrorism in France. And so to think of COP really as a peace, an agreement in pursuit of peace through wholly, I believe, rational means, going to the source of unstable climate. And so I think that's another, it's not just a political agreement, but maybe it's a peace treaty in a way. And one other thing about social justice, this emerged during COP from Oxfam. And I think it really boils down who needs to work hard at their carbon emissions. I recently posted this to Facebook if you're following me. The top 10% emitting 49%. And it even goes beyond that. I'm going to read from this little quote. The average emissions of someone in the poorest 10% of the global population is 60 times less than that of someone in the richest 10%. While estimates at the extreme top and bottom of the global income distribution are more difficult to make, there's no question that the gap is wider still. The richest 1% may emit 30 times more than the poorest 50%, and 175 times more than the poorest 10%. And these super rich, or this wealthy 10%, they exist in many nations as an international elite. So it becomes even more complicated to legislate this stuff without a global agreement that reaches them all the way to the disparity. I thought this was interesting. A shirt placed on that COP, on the Eiffel Tower, reparations for climate debt. This was one of the few mentions of reparations that I heard while I was there. And I didn't hear it, I just saw it. But then let's move to honesty. We're getting close here. You guys are doing great. Thank you for rolling with it. So much detail. Honesty. I was surprised by the honesty that I experienced there. I felt like I was going to get there and I was going to be so upset with the two-faced politician just going in there and saying that we did it and that's it and solved, and they didn't say that. I have a few quotes I want to share that give a sampling of what was said. George Monbiot was quoted in The Guardian as saying, "Let the delegates congratulate themselves on a better agreement than might have been expected, and let them temper it with an apology to all those it will betray." Ban Ki-moon was pretty upbeat, but what often happens is, I need to find a better example of this. Here he says, "A monumental triumph for people and our planet, and a resounding success for multilateralism." Very often, though, you hear the whole quote that they have, and they temper their own enthusiasm in the same speech. So they say, this is monumental, and we have a lot of work to do. Let's get going. And that was why I give points for honesty to this crowd. Even all the way up to Obama, they tempered their enthusiasm with a grounding in, really, there is a ton of work to do. So points for honesty. Even in the COP decision itself, they used this language here. Much greater emissions reduction efforts will be required. Put that in the actual decision. And then this is Obama being real. "The Paris Agreement establishes the enduring framework the world needs to solve the climate crisis. It creates the mechanism, the architecture for us to continually tackle this problem in an effective way. Even if all the initial targets set in Paris are met, we'll only be part of the way there when it comes to reducing carbon from the atmosphere." So he's saying, not good enough, but it sets this framework. So honesty, some good, some bad, but in general, I felt that there was more honesty than I was expecting going into this, but not as much as we need. Market signal. All right, the techno-wizardry. Did we do it? Did we get the market signal right? Well, one of the things that was fun to see was Bill Peduto was there. Bill took part in a massive mayoral market signal. Yeah, Peduto. Our mayor joined what sounds like possibly the largest gathering of mayors ever in Paris. It sounded like maybe 500. I'm not sure. They mentioned over 1,000, about 1,000 city officials. But he was part of a giant pile of mayors that went to Paris and said, we're going to do this. And that was a huge signal in and of itself. There was a lot of business signal as well. And this is, I feel like this is where, these are a lot of businesses that are sponsoring. This is the Grand Palais, where they had a lot of kind of corporate solutions. But they had all the corporate people in there just kind of highlighting what the corporations are doing to move the ball. I've noted that 50 of the world's largest companies agreed to go 100% renewable. There's so many, you can just pick some stats. 1,700 healthcare organizations formed into an alliance with 8,200 hospitals. 13 million healthcare professionals appealed for a strong COP. Nearly 150 national leaders, possibly the largest gathering ever, spoke. 95% of global emissions are covered in the INDCs, those national commitments, versus Kyoto, which covered approximately 15% of global emissions. Now I have here 183 nations submitted INDCs. I think I mentioned 160 before. I think it's 183. And that, I think at least 186 during the talks, at a late point in the talks. The number kept like incrementing, and different leaders would choose different ones to use. And as I mentioned before, it's the first time in history that so many nations have quantified their carbon footprint. 195 total nations involved. But in many ways, we're still reliant upon economic growth. And that was that's always a disappointment for me to hear. I always feel like, oh, if we can just get past the need for economic growth, but they used economic growth a lot. It seems to be that still, they haven't detached themselves from wanting to talk about economic growth. Here's my capitalism slide. They had a big Christmas tree in one of the areas. And also, they canceled the protests, but they kept this Ville de Noël, the Christmas village, going in Paris. And I had mixed emotions about that. Before I got to Paris, I thought, ugh, why can't they let the protests if they have this big Christmas gathering, And then I got there, and I walked through it. And my criticism in my heart sort of softened a little bit. I saw, hundreds of children running around and playing and having Christmas. And thousands and tens of thousands of people in this huge stretch on both sides of the street, beautifully decorated with food and music and drinks and desserts, and it just seemed like so French. That was the core of their spirit in a way for that season. And to bemoan well, you canceled the protest, but you didn't cancel your spirit, I became less critical of that decision. I could understand how in the political arms of the French government that they're like, oh, we cannot cancel this. They didn't cancel it, but they also had military troops parading through it. Not parading, but you'd see a patch with 5 to 10 different troops marching along in full camo and automatic weapons, just walking along to make sure that nothing bad happened. And probably people who were hidden, but tons of cop cars and everything all around. And it was very safe and felt very fun and friendly. And I had some tasty treats there and some dinner there a couple times. And this was the juxtaposition I was waiting for. Ville de Noël and capitalism at its finest. Culture, French culture, but a lot of capitalism. They were selling hoverboards and drones at the Ville de Noël. But there's that fist right on top of the Christmas fun. Buy your stuff. It wasn't all buy your stuff. It was have a wonderful, jolly old time, too. And I did there. So, again, mixed emotions. 50 different ways to slice and dice this thing. All right, but did we get the market signal we were looking for? I thought this was very interesting. Google Trends. Anybody go to Google Trends before? Awesome stuff. I Googled climate. All right, so Google Trends. You can see it's hard to read. 2005, 7, 9, 11, 2013, 2015. This is the Copenhagen, the failed COP agreement. This is COP21. Lower search queries, big market impact? I don't know, but lower search queries. But then I thought, oh, what if I compare it to those things that I saw at that Ville de Noël and at the airport? Hoverboards. Huh. Yeah, a lot more talk about hoverboards than climate at Christmas. And then I thought, who else was I hearing about at COP21? Well, everybody's asking me about Trump, so maybe Trump was doing pretty well on the Google. And sure enough, check it out. Trump, way past hoverboards. And then I thought, well, but nobody in Paris was talking about COP because of ISIS. And ISIS was the most. So did we have the market signal? I don't know. There's pros and cons to it. We certainly didn't exceed the Trump-ISIS combo. And I think in many ways, Trump and ISIS are riding the same train of fear. They both gain recruits by promoting a state of fear. So, market forces. And then public voice. I've tried to include quotes and photos from the public voice all through my presentation so that even though they didn't get the 200,000 voice that I felt they were due at COP, I can try to enhance their voice through my presentation and through my photos, again, which are all on Creative Commons. At the beginning of COP, they said, protests and concerts and everything banned. As we learned, protests were not officially banned. Some protests were allowed. Also, concerts were allowed. There's Bill McKibben there at Pathway to Paris. I was thrilled to go. I bought a ticket months in advance. Bill McKibben, Naomi Klein. This is where I felt like my people were going to gather. And sure enough, they gathered. There was extensive security at the door. You had to get patted down and everything checked out. But we got in there. Everybody was safe. And it was a wonderful, beautiful, thoughtful concert with music and reading and speeches and other things like that. It was a wonderful time. And I like seeing Bill McKibben. And I really admire his work. And here's his quote, which I think is really a good one. Every government seems now to recognize that the fossil fuel era must end, and soon. But the power of the fossil fuel industry is reflected in the text, which drags out the transition so far that endless climate damage will be done. Since pace is the crucial question now, activists must redouble our efforts to weaken that industry. This didn't save the planet, but it may have saved the chance of saving the planet. And I thought that really was a good way to kind of sum it up. Thanks, Bill. And Bill has been working on and continues to work on some major actions, big national, international civil disobedience in 2016 in May, I believe, early May. But stay tuned for that. Stay tuned on my website. I'll highlight for you what's going on. There will obviously be opportunities for people who do and don't want to get arrested, but they're not taking this agreement, lying down. They are going to then put on the full court press, and it's going to get very interesting and very active in the future. There were protests. There were some wonderful protest signs. That's not an original one so much, but I liked it. This one I loved. They had these bollards, and they put a sign down to make it look like there's a Pinocchio nose on the guy. That's Hollande, and they're just calling him out on some French lie. I don't know what it is, but I just thought the sign was clever. Lots of activist cleverness all around. A couple more, a little bit of the public voice here. This was at the Alternativa thing. This happened in the middle of the COP, in the middle weekend. I was able to go for just a few minutes on Saturday, and it was basically like almost like a French Screen Festival, or Mother Earth News Fair, sort of. That had that same vibe to it. Organic foods, farms, alternative media, all sorts of stuff. This gets a little bit more technical, though. I wanted to highlight populations. So I was doing some math with radius and volume, area and stuff like that. This is the planned protest in Paris of 200,000. Actual protests, I would estimate around, what have I got estimated? Around 20,000 maybe more, but that's estimate. Some of those protests happened in the climate generation space, which I suspect could fit about 10,000 people. And then there was this security public-private access line there. Climate Generations, you could walk to the Le Bourget from Climate Generations, but then you go to Le Bourget, the blue zone. Climate Generations is at Le Bourget. Le Bourget is like the name of the site, like this little airport that they had way out of Paris. So it was not in downtown, it was like way outside. Blue zone could fit about 40,000 people, and it sounded like about 10,000 were like the special private negotiations plenary hall, like where it required even more secure access than I could get. And then there were just a tiny amount of protests. Maybe 500 people participated in a protest at some point during the 2 weeks in the blue zone. And all those were like super sanctioned. And I think if there are problems that I've heard rumors that if you get a pass as a part of some affiliated group, then if you do something nasty or not sanctioned, then that group risks losing all their passes. So it's like an access thing. So protests were tolerated, not technically canceled. And the ones that were there, I note here, they were beautiful and familiar. It was lovely to just feel that there were people with that energy participating in Paris. I think I have a little video that comes up, and I was tickled. You'll see one of the little chants, or one of the little groups, a couple times. They were chanting in English, but with a French accent. I thought that was so cute. I think this is a little video that it's just a little summary of all the different protest actions that I had a piece of video to share so that you can get a sense of what was going on visually.
Defending itself!
And a new life is beginning. And we feel it, we're ready to risk our lives for it, we're laughing about it, we're dancing about it, amen, it's happening now, amen, Earth-alleluia.
Amen, Earth-alleluia.
And that's why we're at the turning point. Amen.
Thank you, Reverend. Thank you, Earth-alleluia.
Imagine that times 200,000 could have been. No lack of enthusiasm, no lack of creativity. Unfortunate cancellation. Lots of things are coming up next. Things to watch for, the technicalities. There will be a signature ceremony on April 22nd with the agreement open for signing through April 2017. I want to pay special attention to Nicaragua, Bolivia, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, India, China, and the US to see what shenanigans happen around whether they sign, whether they ratify, whether they don't, So those are nations that I'm really curious about. 55 nations must ratify with a minimum 55% of global greenhouse gas emissions for the treaty to be put in place. There will be possibly some kind of adaptation review in 2017, a preliminary review of the INDCs, as I mentioned, in 2018, some kind of facilitative dialogue. So those then will be sort of, they might, if they're really good, they'll tweak their INDCs in 2018 and then put them in place in 2020 and then change them again in 2025. But we'll see. That 2018, that's just a political push. It's not like you're gonna make them better. It's just a, hey, we're gonna revisit these. First stock take in 2023. I think that's where they're gonna start to talk about the 2025 INDCs in 2023. I mentioned already $100 billion a year through 2025, starting in 2020, then possibly more. So $100 billion is regarded as a floor of aid. Billion, 100 billion, yep. And the next UNFCCC ad hoc working group convenes in Bonn, Germany, May 16th through 26th, 2016. So that's like this UNFCCC group that organized COP, they just keep going. They just keep chipping away, working that issue. So this is a momentous one, but this is an ongoing process that will continue. COP22, I don't have any plans to go to that one, but who knows, is November 7th through 18th in 2016 in Marrakesh, Morocco, which has a really cool sustainability story, just from the little bits and pieces that I've heard. I'm going to get one more. And then, just a note of what to watch for next. Don't forget some of those reflections and pay close attention to what it really takes to get to 1.5C and even to 2C. Now, I've heard that we've got to stop building fossil fuel dependent infrastructure by 2018 to hit 2C. And so we need to pay attention here and hold our politicians and our leaders and ourselves accountable to hit possibly zero fossil fuel emissions by 2030. Or 2050, maybe, to hit that 1.5C. And then also really focus on massive negative emissions technology on top of cutting our emissions fast. I'm feeling the vibe. People are getting ready to go, and it's been wonderful, and it's 9:14. I want to have a concluding remark that I have included in an article that's going out in the Merton Center, the new people. And I want to highlight the conclusion of this event. It was uniquely, distinctly emotional for me. I'll read this little piece. So the COP was adopted at 7:27 p.m. on Saturday evening, December 12th. And when the COP agreement was finally adopted, a thunderous roar emerged from the large plenary hall, followed by images of tears, hugs, and hands clasped in celebration. These were not simply bureaucrats checking boxes for their fossil-fueled masters. I suspect they knew that we have a challenging road ahead, but they paused to joyfully celebrate this small victory filled with huge, if insufficient, accomplishments. It is a testament to the profound challenge presented by climate change that a diplomatic event as monumental and celebrity-studded as this, as COP21, would present such a humble step in the necessary path towards transformation. It's now time for us all to engage our hearts and our minds and our bodies to bring our dear humanity the rest of the way home. I'll leave it with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.